Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you about strategic communication today. I'm very proud to call myself a strategic communicator, and I am pretty sure that a lot of you may already think of yourself as one as well, or if you don't, hopefully you'll realize how strategic you are at communicating by the end of this presentation. I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes and we're going to leave time for questions. So please, if you've got any questions, don't hesitate to put them in the chat or make a note of them. So thank you for that generous introduction, Peter. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm talking to you from Nipaluna, Hobart in Lutruwita, Tasmania, and I'd like to acknowledge the Palawa Pakana people of Lutruwita. And this is really important for us when we talk about strategic communication, because of course we know that Indigenous peoples are storytellers and they have shared a lot of their knowledge through their stories. And that for me is one of the most important things that we always need to remember about communication, is that it's actually really about being human, and it's not a new art. And we might have a lot of new technologies that are making it more challenging or easier, depending on what day of the week it is. That's one of the things you learn in this course about strategic communication that I'm going to share a little bit with you about. So first of all, it's really important to have a definition. A lot of us assume we know what it is to be strategic, and we also communicate, of course, every day. But fundamentally, strategic communications has emerged as a field of research and study out of organisational theory. And many of you will have come across that also in your previous work. But essentially, it's defined as how we actually function as an organisation, communicate both internally and externally, thinking of the organisation as a social actor. And that part of the definition that says in advance of its mission really means that to communicate truly strategically, you need to have developed relationships and you need to be practicing ethically to have legitimacy and credibility as a strategic communicator. So I'll return to these themes a couple of times, but I do think it's really important. You don't just start communicating strategically. It's built on a foundation of trust and reputation. So it emerged out of a field that a lot of you will have heard of called public relations, but also has its roots in marketing, advertising, and also journalism, which we're going to talk about a bit today. It's a holistic approach, which means that you can communicate strategically across roles in all of those different fields of practice. Public relations has always been thought of as strategic, and it has been the, I guess, theoretical field from which a lot of very good practices have emerged, including corporate social responsibility. In other words, we expect organisations to communicate transparently and openly about their practices, and we expect them to meet certain corporate social responsibility objectives, which means you're not just functioning for profit, you're also functioning for purpose, and you're concerned about sustainability across a whole range of areas, including the environment, and of course, social responsibility, as well as economic sustainability. Marketing and advertising are also part of an integrated communications role today. So that means that you might be, if you're working as a strategic communication specialist, be working across all these areas. And of course, you'll be dealing with the media, which is something we're going to talk about today. But fundamentally, it's emerged in recognition that we really need to manage reputation, and organisations have reputations as well that they try very hard to promote and protect. And of course, crisis communication is a really important part of strategic communication as well. And we actually explicitly teach crisis communication today which is not just dealing with political crises, of course, it's dealing with environmental crises, and also a lot of the crises that emerge from doing business in a very complex public sphere. And that's a term that I'm going to unpack for you today as well. So as you can see from that image, a lot of people associate strategic communication with protest. And the third sector, non-government organisations in particular, are often the most, I guess, imaginative. And it's no secret to you that one of the reasons why they have to be really imaginative is because they often don't have a lot of money to spend on conventional avenues of communication. And that's certainly been the nature of my research, which Peter kindly shared with you. So why would you study strategic communication? You obviously want to understand audiences. You want to build awareness of how the media operates, how we live with and in the media, and how it helps us and hinders us in doing what we do every day. It's also really helpful to understand how information operates, circulates, how it's politicized, how it's what we call mediatized. In other words, the media is that, it's that, if you like, that interceptor, that translator of information from government, for example, to citizens. It's in the middle all the time. So we need to understand how that mediation role functions. And it's really important for you as health workers, as I know it is for me in my research and advocacy in the food movement, to be able to use it to promote change, to be effective and ethical in my communication and tell great stories. And that's where I'm going to go next. I won't have to give you many examples because working in healthcare, you're very, very confident with, I imagine, or perhaps not confident, but very familiar with at least the role of storytelling in changing attitudes and behaviours. And here's just a couple of examples that I picked up from the Harvard Business Review about medical research that has shown how students' attitudes about dementia patients improved after students participated in storytelling exercises that made them more sympathetic to their patients' conditions. Another study found that storytelling approaches were effective in convincing populations at risk for hypertension to change their behaviour. So a lot of it's about telling people things that they can connect to, things that make them empathise, things that make them see hope as well, and understand that there's a roadmap for them. I always think of storytelling as a narrative that helps us to get somewhere. So it's very important to our role as strategic storytellers. And so I should practice what I preach and tell you a little bit about my story, because whenever I talk to people about the fact that I study food, yet I'm a communications researcher, they say, why would you be focusing on food? To me, food is a really big communication problem and a fabulous way to engage people in healthy behaviours. So I actually think here I'm talking to an audience that understands that, because you're working in health and you get the connection between food and a whole lot of other challenges we have in society. My personal story, that's me with my younger sister. We grew up in a fishing business and in a little town on the Queensland coast, and we spent a lot of time out on the water, and my parents were the only owners of this business, so it was a bit of a family affair. And we understood from a really early stage the connection between our own activities, our business, and the health of the environment and the health of people. We were very lucky because we got to eat a lot of fresh fish, and I've always taken with me the great experience of growing up in a family where we actually had access to fabulous, nutritious food that was affordable And we actually looked after the environment carefully as well as a family for that very reason, because it was about our livelihoods. So I guess when Peter introduces my PhD researchers working with small-scale farmers, it's kind of no secret that I understood what they were about. I understood what they were trying to achieve. And that's my most recent book, Food in a Changing Climate. But it took a long way for me to get there. My PhD in the top left corner was about 3 farmers' organisations. And I like to call that's my PhD. It's a bit like one woman with a hoe, which is another story, because that's a bit like what doing a PhD is about. But when I researched how these farmers were campaigning for what they call food sovereignty, I realised again, it was all about storytelling. It was all about understanding their relationship to the land and how the health of their ecosystems, the soil, the air, the livestock they were raising, the plants they were growing. It was all about relationships, and it was part of this incredible story, which is the story of food production. So I've continued to research in this area, and as you can see from the title of some of my work, I'm really interested in how we give voice to people in conversations about food. And again, I think that that's one of the key things about strategic communication. It's not just about talking, it's about listening, and it's about encouraging people to feel like they have agency. And these days it's quite challenging because we have a lot of different platforms to use. A lot of my work's been with conventional media, for example, television, but also independent podcasts and face-to-face communication, sometimes in policy arenas. So strategic communication, yes, it's about the media, but it's also a lot broader than that. Fundamentally, when people ask me that question, just circling back about why I research food, I say food politics is a struggle over communication infrastructure, networks, and domains in a public sphere that is dominated by corporate power, which means that just as in the food industry, dominated by multinational corporations, there's also a concentration of that corporate power in the media, which a lot of you will be very well aware of. Another part of my story is I used to work at Fairfax, the Sydney Morning Herald. So people in Sydney will be familiar with the Herald. And I worked there when that particular organisation was going through a huge transition, which I'll talk to you about a little bit. But first of all, let's go on and talk a little bit about this concept of the public sphere. Sounds like you're going into a history class here, because I'm going to talk about a German philosopher. But what's really good about the strategic communication course is that we do serve you up with quite a lot of tasty theory, as well as getting you to do a lot of exciting practical things. So the public sphere, in case you haven't heard of it, was devised by a gentleman called Jürgen Habermas, and he wrote a book called The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere as his PhD project. He was part of the Frankfurt School. And funnily enough, his supervisors apparently didn't like his thesis. But today it's become, for me, fundamental to the work I do, because it was all about how do you create a place where people can come and have conversations. And it really is the foundation of democracy. Now, Habermas, remember, he wrote this in the 1950s, 60s, pre-internet. He was talking about a very traditional public sphere. What he did was he tracked the history of the development of the public sphere in Germany, England, and France, and they have very different stories. In France, they had a revolution, which brought about, if you like, democracy or a new democratic order. How inclusive it was, of course, is a story for another seminar, very quickly, dramatically. In Germany, Habermas talks about a very slow and sophisticated evolution of what was called the table societies, which was, again, a place where the elite would meet and make decisions. So you can tell already that this public sphere was a place where a lot of people were left out. Certainly, a lot of people, including women, weren't welcome in the coffee house, which is pictured here. which for Habermas was really symbolic of the birth of the modern public sphere. And he tracked it in England back to the development of parliamentary democracy and the Westminster system. What was really fundamental, though, in all these contexts was the development of the printing press. So we have a huge debt to owe the printing press because it actually enabled the publication and circulation of information. Now, obviously, this didn't happen overnight. It depended on the growth of literacy, so it depended on an educated populace, and it also depended very much on what particular language group you were in, because obviously not everybody was able to read or converse in the same dialect. But what it did do was it underpinned a later concept by another scholar who came up with the concept of the imagined community. And you might have heard of Benedict Anderson. The imagined community, again, is the nation, and it relies on a common media. So this tells you that the media is really the foundation of a democratic public sphere, certainly in the eyes of Habermas. Today, we have a digital public sphere, so we're having a really quick zip through history here, where once that legacy media, like the newspapers, including the one I worked for, they used to be the primary nation-building, communication sharing material. And of course, remember, fundamentally, they were places where you did business because you bought and sold products through the press. So there's a little tale encapsulated in this illustration here, this cartoon by Nicholson, which demonstrates to you a huge change with the internet in the way we share information, but also the marketplace. And that is the disappearance of all the advertisements, the classifieds, that's what we called them, the rivers of gold, those little columns of tiny print that used to be in every newspaper. It all went to the internet, and that really undermined the revenue model of the conventional media organisation. As I said, I was at Fairfax, Sydney Morning Herald, publisher of The Age also, in the early 2000s, and I witnessed the way we missed the boat on a lot of these particular shifts. And we were a bit reluctant to invest in online car sales and real estate websites, thinking that advertising revenue would really never disappear, but it actually paid all of our wages. So that's the sort of shift that's happened in the news media, which explains why we have a very fragmented and complex newscape now. This is what we call the digital public sphere. It's called a lot of different things. Some people talk about multiple public spheres. And what I like to just stick to is understanding what's happened fundamentally is now, to an extent, we all control or gatekeep the news. In other words, whereas before we had editors and journalists who were the respected information providers, now in what we initially thought was quite a democratic public sphere, aka the internet, enables us all to say whatever we like within reason. So this has resulted in a public sphere where there's a lot of conversations, a lot of different audiences, but we still have challenges. It's brought us even more challenges around this idea of legitimacy and credibility. And hence, as strategic communicators, we really need to understand it's not enough to just send our messages out into this public sphere. We need to still be respected, responsible, and we need to really understand how do we deal with the media, because the media itself is still, to an extent, a gatekeeper. And the reason I say that is because when we do go to get our news, most of us still go to, and there's research to support this, the trusted brands, including the Sydney Morning Heralds, the Ages, the Guardians, the Conversation, if you're in the world of university, If you're in a local community here in Hobart, you'll still go to the Mercury. You might have your own community newspaper. And of course, we've got news.com, which is the publisher of The Australian. So we still have legacy media very heavily involved in this public sphere. But as strategic communicators, the fragmentation of the public sphere has brought up specific opportunities for us, because here we have a picture of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, who you might be familiar with from the Watergate scandal back in the 70s. These are our real heroic investigative journalists who I would argue are not a thing of the past, but their roles and their visibility has certainly changed a lot. We won't have time to talk about Julian Assange today, but he is an example of a contemporary whistleblower. Whether you want to call him a journalist or not is quite debatable. However, he also played that gatekeeper role in releasing a lot of those cables and files that really had an impact on the political geopolitics. So these are still very important roles. But a strategic communicator plays a really key role these days in this environment where news media organisations are no longer as well resourced. They don't have the investigative clout that they used to when they had a model that supported long form investigations. The Watergate guys spent months, even years, developing their stories. These days, media organisations are under a lot of pressure because they don't have all of that revenue to pay a lot of journalists to spend a lot of time on the one story. So guess where they go? They go directly to organisations, and they go directly to professional communicators, all of whom are strategic communicators. So if you can develop a great relationship with a respected journalist and they respect you, you are able to get your information into this really crowded public sphere. So this is a really good motivation for understanding how that public sphere operates. So fundamentally, what we're talking about is a transformed public sphere, which is what Jürgen Habermas initially said, a public sphere that is transforming in appearance, nature, and character. His structural transformation of the public sphere was the rise of the corporate media and commercialization and commodification of information. So he was talking about yet another change that happened that he thinks impoverished the public sphere because it removed us from those very important face-to-face conversations where we have dialogue and debate. How ironic that today we're talking about another transformation, which has been even more devastating in terms of access to transparent information. What we're also challenged with today is disruption, technological innovation that is happening at an unprecedented rate. So here we have these changes happening. We have conventional or legacy media organisations like the Sydney Morning Herald, described here as SMH, struggling to maintain their position, struggling still to do good investigative journalism. And I've provided you with the title of this article in the Drum, which I suggest you do go to and read if you're interested in knowing more about strategic communication. This is a quote from it. In the midst of filter bubbles and echo chambers, we struggle to understand each other's differences and find common ground. The result is a community that feels more fragmented and polarized than ever before. The role of our newsrooms is to go further than simply providing the facts and balance to report on today's complexity. We need to reclaim the cultural ability to listen, learn, and engage with new ideas without seeding division. That is why independent thinking and open understanding is so crucial. So if you're really honest, think to yourself for a second, what's your filter bubble? What is your echo chamber? If you're getting your news online and the algorithm is giving you what it thinks you need and what you like, it will be what you like. It won't be what you need. In other words, we need to actively seek news from a diverse set of reliable, legitimate, and trusted news organizations. What we need to do as strategic communicators is understand what those sources are, what those organizations are, and also work with them, because this quote tells you what the fourth estate, which is what the media has always been called, the fourth estate, as in the independent arbiter of justice, exposing wrongdoing, bad practice across all spheres of life. How do we actually become really very sophisticated and embedded interlocutors? In other words, how do we become part of this public sphere in a good way, in a positive way? Knowing that we're dealing these days with a lot of challenges, including fake news, deep fakes, especially across all of the different platforms that we're operating. So the reason why I always say to my students, why do we need to be studying media and communications when everybody has access to devices and can tell stories now? We need more than ever to understand that we are operating within, as Mark Doozy says, and I love this, the media is water to us. We are so embedded in it, so surrounded by it, that we never even notice anymore when we're engaging with it. So basically, we're so attached to all of these different mediums of communication that we actually need to step back sometimes, challenge our assumptions, and think, how are we getting our news and our information, and how are we also talking about our organizations and our work, which means also, of course, representing yourself as always someone speaking on behalf of an issue or a cause through your work. So what do you learn in a strategic media and communications course? You learn how to identify the right platform for the job. And part of that is understanding that these days it's going to be a combination of legacy media and online media. And this is just a couple of examples that I'm sure some of you are already familiar with and using, I imagine, quite adeptly. X, formerly Twitter, I'll be honest, I've stepped out for a while. I don't think as a strategic communicator, you have to be everywhere all at once. But one thing about most of our communication platforms, often and transparently, is the main secret for effective communication. So if you want to engage with a social media platform, you have to do it regularly. Facebook is great for community building, even though a lot of younger people will tell you that they've migrated right away from it. It tends to be their parents on it now. And of course, Instagram, along with a whole range of different platforms like Snapchat, they come and go, but they are very well utilized by people who we'll talk about in a tick, which is the influencers, who increasingly are people who are at least getting the most followers. So this is a whole new language of the media that we have compared to the world that I entered when I started working in the media in the 2000s, early 2000s. Strategic communicators really understand audiences. They understand that it's difficult to target publics. It's not efficient or effective to broadcast anymore. What we used to have with the conventional media or the legacy media was a one-to-many model. Broadcasting is all about everybody getting the same information from the same source. We know it doesn't work like that anymore. Therefore, you have to talk to different publics doing different, using different channels. And you also have to talk in a different language. It's no longer about readership and circulation, which was the language I used to talk at Fairfax. It's about views and clicks and likability and relatability. So you need to understand that particular language, which is something you learn in a strategic communications course. You also, to be an effective strategic communicator, you obviously know how to connect. So here's this word, the influencer. As much as you'd like to deny it, you might be one. If you've got quite a large following or a particular flair for social media, you might be an influencer in a positive way. Influencers are very good at seamlessly combining lifestyle with message. And a lot of the time, conventional organizations these days seek out these people because they appear to do it in a very authentic way. So this is all about authenticity. But again, it takes a lot of practice and a lot of repetition to be able to do this really credibly. It really does demonstrate, if you follow an influencer and watch what they do carefully, you will see how they are actually very good at managing that functionality of social media. A lot of us just post aimlessly, or perhaps we think sharing a story will actually automatically translate into a lot of exposure, but a crafty influencer will do it through a myriad of channels, using all of the tools, all of what we call the affordances of social media. And they'll spend a lot of time doing it because, as we say, it's part of their lifestyle as they represent it. And finally, my last message is that strategic communicators are very good at measuring and evaluating their success. So something you will do in a media and communications course is understand what tools are available to you to enable you to understand how your messages are being taken up. That includes qualitative understanding of how the tone or tenor of your message is, whether you need to fine-tune messages, understanding doing environmental scanning of the landscape to understand when and where is the opportune time for you to send out your messages, and also how to find those hooks in the broader conversation to enable you to participate in the discourse with your particular message. And quantitative methods as well, because these days we have a wealth of technology available to us that enables us to crunch data. So analytics, use of dashboards, etc. Many of you may already be using those yourselves in your daily work. But in short, just to give you a quick look at, before we return to questions, our units, and I just wanted to show you this little snapshot just to give you an indication of some of the things that you would be studying if you did some of our electives. They focus on different aspects of strategic communication, and you can tell from the titles that some of them focus on particular fields. Communicating science, for example, is one of our most popular ones, just because we have so much access, and I would say this would be very true for those of you working in healthcare, access to great information that's challenging for lay audiences. In other words, how do you do data visualization? How do you tell compelling stories without drowning people in data? How do you also tackle challenging conversations around issues that can lead people to avoid information, for example, talking about climate change and climate risk. We've also got, of course, a lot of emphasis on the creative arts, and we have a fabulous relationship with our Diploma of Creative Arts and Health. So there's a lot of crossover already between the health and communications areas in my School of Creative Arts and Media. And digital media deserves, of course, a lot of attention in this course, but more and more, I would say more and more, it's becoming really important that you understand that storytelling is not confined to one particular platform, and it's not about the technology as much as it is about the way you tell the story. So thank you so much for your attention. I will turn back to Peter, I think, and we will have a conversation about things that you'd like to raise from the presentation or any questions about things I haven't covered.
Great. Thank you very much, Alana. That was a great presentation, and I learned a lot about it. Media I hadn't learned before. So thank you for providing this presentation, and we'll just open it for questions. If there are any questions, could you please put them in the chat? I don't see any questions, but Alana, I do have a question for you though. A couple of years ago, I have been collecting a lot of news clippings from our local newspapers in Tasmania about health. And what we noticed was that probably 95 to 96% of these articles were very negative in nature. And so and there's so many good things happening in health. So how, as strategic communicators, would we influence the media to also provide a positive perspective on health and the delivery of healthcare?
It's a really terrific question, Peter, and it is an ongoing challenge because the news values, which again many people will be familiar with, often focus on conflict, and they focus on prominent people, and they love to focus on scandal. That's where understanding how to deal with the media and frame a story is something we teach people. It's not a case of having, for example, a fabulous story to tell about, just say you have a new therapeutic practice that's really changing lives. Here we have a really good example of, rather than going to a journalist with a story about the science, telling them about actually how this practice works, as to telling them the story of a patient and presenting that in a way that, again, a journalist knows will connect with their audience. So it's being very aware of what drives the journalism cycle and not subverting it, but just understanding that a journalist will be much more likely to listen if they understand the impact that that particular technology or practice is having on people's lives. So it's very much having, a lot of our responses around really important social issues are reactive because they get into the news when something goes wrong. If you can be on the front foot and already have a relationship with a journalist about things that are really positive, you will have a much better experience when something does happen, because you may also be the person that they go to for a comment when something does go wrong. And yes, when things do go wrong, when there's a crisis, we need to address it, but understanding how to talk about it is something that you need to be trained to do. And I think that's really hard, because people often have a bad experience with the media because they simply haven't been taught how that world operates.
Thank you. I noticed there are quite a few questions. I'll see. So there's a question. Do you cover how to collect stories to promote a program that people can choose to implement or not? So the program is not telling the stories, it's the users of the program telling stories.
I'll just read that one. Oh, sorry, did you get it via Q&A? Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you cover how to collect stories to promote a program that people can choose to implement or not? Yes, yes. The users telling the stories. That's exactly right. Show, not tell, we often say. So actually, what our classes actually depend on, and that's what's great about postgraduate study, is that we have people in the class who do have that practitioner experience. So you're coming with all your understandings from the workplace. And so you certainly will have opportunity to develop stories around what you want to promote in your workplace. That real life experience, that lived experience of being able to engage with your own work in producing the stories is exactly what we aim for you to do. And yeah, it is about, again, telling, as you said yourself, telling those stories rather than telling about the science, if you like. There's a lot of issues around ethics, of course, and that's something else that we cover in the course. You're obviously steeped in ethics as healthcare workers, but a real important set of principles go with dealing with the media and also with being a journalist. So we actually get you to understand those as well.
Thank you, Alana. I don't think there are any other questions at the moment, so far I can see. No, it doesn't look like it. So thank you again, Alana, for your presentation, and I hope that everyone has enjoyed it as much as I did. And we will be in contact with all the participants from today, and we'll provide you with a more information and a PowerPoint presentation as well. And I wish you a good night. Thank you.
Thank you.